You woke up today with questions, not answers. Your heart feels heavy, your mind is crowded, and the future looks unclear. What if this morning isn't about seeing results, but learning to trust God anyway? This powerful morning prayer will guide you through fear, silence, waiting, and doubt, teaching you how to walk by faith when sight offers nothing but uncertainty. If you've been praying and wondering why nothing has changed, this message is for you. Let this prayer strengthen your spirit, quiet your anxiety, and remind you that God is working even when you can't see it. Today, faith rises before the evidence appears. The day breaks quietly, but clarity does not arrive with the sunrise. As morning light filters through windows and streets slowly awaken, many hearts remain heavy with unanswered questions. Reports from countless lives echo the same theme. Worries carried over from yesterday, decisions still unresolved, prayers spoken but seemingly unheard. This is not a morning of confidence, but of uncertainty, where the mind wakes faster than hope and the soul feels the weight before the body even rises. In these early hours, fear does not shout, it whispers. It speaks through the calendar filled with obligations, the phone holding unread messages, the bank balance that refuses to change, and the body that wakes already tired. Sight becomes the dominant reporter, presenting evidence of lack, delay, and struggle. What is seen feels final, measurable, and unavoidable, making faith seem distant and fragile before the day even begins. Doubt settles in subtly, disguised as logic and realism. It questions whether today will be any different, whether strength will be enough, whether God is truly at work behind the scenes. This chapter exposes a shared human experience. The quiet battle that begins before breakfast, where the heart wrestles between believing God's promises and trusting the visible facts lined up against them. Heaviness becomes the unspoken headline of the morning. Some wake with grief that has no words, others with anxiety they cannot explain. The silence of dawn amplifies every concern, and the absence of immediate answers feels louder than any noise. In this moment, unanswered prayers are not forgotten. They are felt deeply, pressing against the soul like unfinished stories demanding resolution. Yet within this uncertainty, a critical truth begins to emerge. The lack of clarity is not a sign of abandonment, but an invitation. When sight offers only limitations and problems, it reveals its own weakness. This is the moment when human understanding reaches its edge, and faith is quietly summoned. Not because everything makes sense, but precisely because it does not. Faith is not born in certainty, but in the presence of unanswered questions. The morning may begin without clarity, but it does not begin without purpose. In this vulnerable space, where fear, doubt, and heaviness coexist, faith prepares to rise, ready to lead where sight can no longer guide. The morning continues, but the tension intensifies as the mind begins to measure the day ahead. Reality presents itself through visible facts, deadlines approaching, responsibilities piling up, and problems that refuse to shrink with optimism alone. Every glance at the world seems to reinforce the same message. What you see is what you get. In this space, faith feels challenged, not by open rebellion, but by the steady pressure of circumstances demanding attention and control. As the hours begin to move, an inner conflict unfolds quietly but relentlessly. The heart remembers the promises of God, words spoken in prayer, verses once held tightly, moments when hope felt unshakable. Yet the eyes report something different. They point to closed doors, delayed answers, and a path that appears uncertain at best. This battle is not external. It is fought in thoughts, emotions, and silent pauses where belief must confront evidence. Fear gains strength when sight becomes the loudest voice. It argues with precision, reminding the soul of past disappointments and warning of future risks. It insists that faith without visible proof is irresponsible, even foolish. In these moments, belief feels fragile, as though one more unanswered prayer could cause it to fracture completely. The struggle is no longer abstract. It is personal, urgent, and deeply human. Yet faith does not retreat without a fight. It rises quietly, not denying reality, but refusing to be ruled by it. Faith remembers that God's work has never been limited to what is immediately visible. It recalls that every breakthrough once lived in the unseen, every answered prayer began as a hope without evidence. This realization creates friction, a dramatic tension between trusting what is seen and surrendering to what is promised. The conflict sharpens as choice enters the scene. The believer must decide which voice will lead the day. Sight demands certainty before movement, proof before trust, results before praise. Faith, however, asks for obedience first, even when the path is unclear. This choice feels costly, because choosing faith means risking disappointment, misunderstanding, and vulnerability once again. In this chapter, the struggle reaches its emotional peak. The soul stands at a crossroads, aware that leaning on sight alone leads to fear, while leaning on faith requires courage. There is no instant resolution, only a moment of decision, one that defines the direction of the heart. The battle remains unresolved, but something shifts. Faith may be challenged, but it is still standing. A quiet resolve begins to form. Sight has spoken, but it no longer holds absolute authority. Faith, though tested, refuses to surrender. The battle between what is seen and what is believed has exposed a deeper truth. The outcome of the day will not be determined by circumstances, but by which voice the heart chooses to follow. As the inner battle begins to exhaust the soul, a deeper realization emerges. The struggle is not only between faith and sight, but between control and trust. The desire to manage outcomes, predict results, and protect oneself from disappointment becomes painfully clear. In the quiet moments before the day fully unfolds, the heart recognizes how tightly it has been holding onto plans, timelines, and expectations. Believing that control offers safety when, in truth, it has only increased the weight being carried. The morning air feels heavy with unspoken resistance. Surrender does not come easily, because it feels like loss. Letting go of control seems risky, even frightening, especially when the future appears uncertain. The mind argues that releasing control means inviting chaos, yet the soul senses that true peace cannot be found while gripping what was never meant to be held. This tension creates a dramatic pause, where the heart hovers between fear and faith. Prayer becomes the turning point, not as a ritual, but as an act of courage. Words rise slowly, hesitantly, acknowledging weakness instead of hiding it. In this moment, the believer admits exhaustion from trying to carry what only God can handle. Control is named, exposed, and gently placed down. Not because all answers are given, but because the burden has become too heavy to bear alone. As surrender begins, something unexpected happens. The fear of losing control is met with a quiet sense of relief. The soul realizes that God's sovereignty does not threaten its safety. It secures it. Trust starts to replace tension, not dramatically or instantly, but steadily, like light creeping into darkness. This shift marks a crucial transformation. Faith is no longer theoretical, it is practiced. The act of surrender deepens as expectations are released alongside plans. Timelines that once demanded urgency are loosened, and outcomes that once felt essential are entrusted to God's wisdom. This is not resignation, but alignment, a recognition that divine purpose often unfolds beyond human understanding. Choosing obedience without knowing what comes next. Even as control is surrendered, the unanswered questions remain. Problems are not magically solved, and circumstances do not suddenly change. Yet the atmosphere of the heart is different. Anxiety begins to lose its grip, replaced by a growing confidence that God is present in the waiting. Surrender proves to be not the end of effort, but the beginning of dependence. As the sun rises higher, the chapter closes with a quiet but powerful resolve. Control has been released, and trust has taken its place. The day is no longer approached as a battle to manage, but as a journey to walk with God. In surrender, faith gains strength, preparing the heart for what lies ahead, even when the path remains unseen. After surrender is offered, an unexpected stillness follows. The heart waits for immediate reassurance, a clear sign, or a sudden change, but none arrives. Instead, silence settles in. It is not empty, yet it feels heavy, stretching moments into long pauses where answers seem just out of reach. This silence becomes the new landscape of faith, testing whether trust depends on constant affirmation or can survive without it. The mind begins to interpret the quiet, searching for meaning where no words are given. Doubt attempts to re-enter, suggesting that silence means neglect or delay. Questions resurface with sharper edges. Did God hear the prayer? Was surrender enough? In the absence of clear direction, the heart must confront its expectations, realizing how often it equates God's presence with noise and certainty. Yet beneath the surface, something unseen is taking place. The silence is not passive, it is active, refining the soul. In this chapter, faith learns to breathe without constant reassurance. Trust deepens, not because circumstances improve, but because reliance shifts from emotional confirmation to spiritual conviction. The drama lies in believing that God is working even when nothing appears to be happening. Memories of past faithfulness begin to rise, breaking through the quiet. Moments when God moved unexpectedly, provided at the last moment, or opened doors once thought closed return to the heart. These reflections become anchors, holding belief steady while the present remains unresolved. The silence, once intimidating, slowly transforms into a space of remembrance and preparation. As time passes, the heart learns to listen differently. Not for loud instructions or immediate answers, but for subtle assurance, a peace that cannot be explained, a steadiness that replaces anxiety. This shift marks a profound change. Faith matures when it no longer demands constant proof. The quiet becomes sacred, no longer feared, but honored. The weight of waiting remains, but it no longer crushes. The believer begins to understand that God's silence is not rejection, but trust-building. It is here, in the unseen and unheard moments, that faith is strengthened beyond emotion. This realization turns waiting into worship and uncertainty into endurance. God may be silent, but He is not absent. The heart stands firm, trusting that the same God who speaks also works in quiet ways. In this silence, faith is no longer fragile. It is being forged, ready for the next step forward. The silence does not last forever, but it also does not end with clear directions. Instead of a detailed plan, the heart receives a quiet nudge to move. There is no full picture of what lies ahead, only the sense that standing still is no longer an option. Faith now demands action, not because everything is understood, but because trust has grown deep enough to step forward without certainty. Each step feels deliberate and heavy with consequence. The believer moves cautiously, aware that the path is unfamiliar and the outcome uncertain. Sight searches desperately for markers, signs of progress, evidence of approval, but finds very little. Yet faith presses on, grounded in the conviction that obedience matters more than understanding. The drama of this chapter unfolds in the tension between hesitation and resolve. Fear attempts to reclaim control as movement begins. It warns of potential failure, reminding the heart of past mistakes and unfinished prayers. Walking without a map feels reckless, even dangerous, when logic demands clarity. But faith responds with quiet strength, insisting that direction often reveals itself only after the first step is taken. This internal dialogue becomes the pulse of the journey forward. As progress continues, small changes begin to surface. Not dramatic breakthroughs, but subtle confirmations. Unexpected peace, renewed strength, moments of clarity that arrive just in time. These are not guarantees, but reminders that God is present on the path, even when the destination remains hidden. Faith learns to recognize God's guidance in movement, not in complete understanding. The act of walking transforms the heart itself. What once felt paralyzing now becomes purposeful. The believer discovers that courage grows through action, not waiting. Each step taken without a map builds resilience, teaching the soul that dependence on God is not weakness, but strength. The journey reshapes fear into faith-driven perseverance. Still, uncertainty remains a constant companion. There are moments of doubt, pauses filled with questions, and glances backward toward familiar ground. Yet the heart no longer turns back. Faith has claimed the lead, reminding the believer that growth rarely happens in comfort zones. Forward movement, even slow and unsteady, becomes an act of worship. The destination is still unseen, but the direction is clear. Walking by faith is no longer an idea, it is a lived reality. Without a map, but with trust firmly anchored in God, the believer continues forward, confident that each step is being guided, even when the way cannot yet be seen. As the journey continues, fatigue begins to surface in ways that cannot be ignored. Faithful steps, taken without a map, have demanded emotional, mental, and spiritual energy. The heart, once fueled by resolve, now feels the weight of endurance. This chapter opens with an honest acknowledgement. Even those walking by faith grow tired, and weariness does not mean failure. It reveals the depth of the journey. The body moves forward, but the soul feels drained. Questions return, not with fear, but with exhaustion. How much longer? How many more steps? The believer realizes that faith is not sustained by personal strength alone. The drama deepens as the heart confronts its limitations, discovering that human endurance has an endpoint, and pride quietly fades in the face of need. In this vulnerable state, hope seems distant, almost unreachable. Yet it is precisely here that divine strength begins to rise. not as a sudden surge of energy, but as a gentle infusion of peace that steadies the soul. God meets the believer in weakness, offering rest without stopping the journey, and reassurance without removing the challenge. The heart learns a critical truth. Strength is not the absence of weakness, but the presence of trust within it. This realization transforms weariness into dependence. Instead of pushing harder, the believer leans deeper into God's presence, allowing grace to carry what effort no longer can. The journey continues, but now it is sustained by something greater than determination. Moments of renewal begin to appear, often unexpected and quiet. A word that encourages, a breath of calm in the midst of pressure, a reminder that God sees every step taken in faith. These moments do not erase the struggle, but they restore the soul's ability to continue. Hope, once faint, begins to flicker again. As hope returns, perspective shifts. The believer understands that weariness does not disqualify faith, it refines it. Each step taken while tired becomes an act of trust, proving that faith is strongest not when the path is easy, but when perseverance is required. This chapter captures the emotional turning point where endurance replaces urgency. Not because strength has fully returned, but because hope has. The believer rises again, weary yet sustained, weak yet carried. Faith moves forward, anchored in the truth that God's strength is made perfect not in confidence, but in surrender, and that hope remains alive, even in the most exhausting moments of the journey. The journey reaches a defining moment where faith is no longer just endurance, but bold declaration. The believer stands in a place where circumstances still look unchanged, yet something powerful has shifted within. This chapter opens with a daring act, choosing to believe in victory before there is any visible proof. It is here that faith rises beyond survival and steps into confident expectation. Sight continues to report the same familiar facts: unfinished struggles, unanswered prayers, and outcomes still hidden in uncertainty. But faith now responds differently. Instead of shrinking back, it speaks with authority, declaring trust in God's promises despite the absence of confirmation. This dramatic contrast marks a turning point. The heart no longer waits for evidence to believe, but believes in order to see. Praise becomes an act of defiance against doubt. Gratitude is offered not for what has already happened, but for what is promised. This is not denial of reality, but recognition of a higher truth. The believer understands that faith's greatest power is released when trust is expressed before results arrive. The atmosphere of the heart shifts from tension to anticipation. Emotionally, this moment feels risky. To declare victory without evidence invites vulnerability, even disappointment. Yet faith accepts this risk, grounded in the conviction that God's word is more reliable than current circumstances. The drama intensifies as the believer chooses obedience over outcome, worship over worry, and confidence over caution. As this mindset takes root, fear begins to lose its influence. It no longer dictates responses or shapes expectations. The believer recognizes that victory is not always immediate or visible, but it is certain when entrusted to God. This realization brings a deep, unshakable peace, one that exists even while waiting. The heart now sees waiting differently. It is no longer passive, but active, filled with praise, expectation, and trust. Each moment becomes an opportunity to reinforce belief, to speak life into uncertainty, and to align the soul with God's promises. Faith no longer feels fragile. It feels authoritative and alive. Victory has not yet appeared in sight, but it has already been claimed in faith. The believer stands firm, confident that what God has spoken will come to pass. In choosing faith over evidence, the heart steps into its boldest moment yet, trusting that the unseen is already at work, preparing the breakthrough ahead. The day now stands fully formed, no longer a distant horizon but a present reality. The believer rises into it changed, not because every problem has vanished, but because fear no longer leads the way. Faith, tested through uncertainty, silence, surrender, movement, weariness, and bold declaration, has taken its rightful place at the center of the heart. This chapter opens with transformation, not loud or dramatic on the outside, but deep and undeniable within. What once felt overwhelming now feels manageable, not because circumstances are smaller, but because perspective is stronger. The believer looks at the same world with new eyes. Challenges still exist, responsibilities still demand attention, and unanswered prayers may still linger, but they no longer define the day. Faith reframes everything, reminding the heart that God's presence is greater than any obstacle ahead. Confidence emerges, not rooted in self, but in trust. The believer no longer needs constant reassurance to move forward. There is a quiet assurance that God is already active within the day, arranging moments, strengthening resolve, and guiding steps unseen. This confidence does not eliminate effort. It empowers it, turning ordinary actions into purposeful obedience. The rhythm of the day shifts as faith becomes the anchor. Decisions are no longer driven by panic, reactions no longer shaped by fear. Even uncertainty feels different now. Less threatening, more manageable. The believer understands that walking by faith does not mean avoiding storms, but remaining steady within them. This realization brings calm where chaos once ruled. Gratitude begins to flow naturally, not forced or conditional. The heart gives thanks not only for blessings received, but for growth gained through struggle. Each chapter of the journey now holds meaning, revealing how God used uncertainty to build trust and silence to strengthen belief. What once felt painful is now recognized as purposeful. The believer steps fully into the day with readiness. There is no need to see the entire path, only the next faithful step. Faith has proven itself sufficient, reliable, and sustaining. The day is no longer something to survive, but something to walk through with God, intentionally, courageously, and expectantly. A quiet declaration settles in the heart. I will walk by faith, not by sight. This is no longer just a prayer, but a posture. Fear has lost its authority, doubt has lost its grip, and faith now directs the journey forward. The story closes not with an ending, but with a beginning. The believer rises into the day anchored in faith, prepared for whatever lies ahead. Sight may report uncertainty, but faith speaks truth. And with that truth leading the way, the heart moves forward, steady, confident, and unshaken. The journey that began in uncertainty now stands complete, not because every question has been answered, but because the heart has been transformed. What started as a quiet, fearful morning has become a declaration of trust forged through surrender, silence, obedience, endurance, and praise. Faith has proven itself not as a feeling that comes and goes, but as a decision made again and again when sight offered no reassurance. Faith does not eliminate struggle. It redefines it. The doubts, delays, and weariness were not signs of failure, but invitations to trust God beyond human understanding. Every moment of uncertainty became a training ground, strengthening belief where clarity was absent and hope seemed fragile. The believer now understands that God was present in every stage of the journey. He was there in the unanswered questions, in the silent waiting, in the hesitant steps forward, and in the moments of exhaustion. Nothing was wasted. Each experience shaped a faith that no longer depends on circumstances to remain strong. Walking by faith has become more than a theme, it is now a way of life. The heart has learned to move forward without demanding explanations, to trust without visible proof, and to praise without immediate results. This kind of faith is not loud, but it is powerful. It anchors the soul when everything else feels uncertain. The victory claimed before evidence has now settled into confidence. Not arrogance, not presumption, but a deep assurance that God's promises stand firm regardless of timing. The believer no longer waits passively for change, but lives actively in expectation, knowing that God is faithful even when outcomes are unseen. This conclusion does not promise a life without challenges. Instead, it offers something greater, a faith that can endure them. A faith that rises in the morning without fear, stands steady in silence, and moves boldly into the unknown. A faith that trusts God's character more than visible results. As the journey ends, a final truth remains clear and unshakable. Sight may inform the moment, but faith defines the direction. And with faith leading the way, the believer walks forward, not overwhelmed, not afraid, but confident that every step is held by God. This is not the end of the story, but the foundation for every day that follows. The prayer has done its work. The heart is ready. And the path ahead, though unseen, is now walked by faith, strong, steady, and fully surrendered. The morning prayer does not end when the sun is fully risen. It follows the believer into every hour that comes after. This chapter opens with a powerful realization. Faith must now live beyond words and moments of devotion. What was declared in quiet prayer must be carried into conversations, decisions, conflicts, and unexpected challenges. The heart understands that walking by faith is no longer a temporary posture. It is a daily commitment. As the day unfolds, real-life pressures begin to test what was prayed for. Interruptions arrive without warning, responsibilities demand attention, and difficulties resurface with familiar intensity. Yet something is different now. The believer notices a new steadiness, an inner restraint that refuses to panic or retreat. Faith does not remove pressure, but it changes how pressure is handled, transforming reactions into responses guided by trust. Moments of temptation arise, tempting the heart to return to old patterns, worry, control, and fear-driven decisions. Sight once again tries to take the lead, pointing out risks, worst-case scenarios, and reasons to doubt. This chapter becomes deeply dramatic as the believer stands at repeated crossroads, realizing that faith is not proven once, but chosen repeatedly throughout the day. In these moments, the prayer spoken in the morning becomes a lifeline. The believer recalls the surrender, the silence, the steps taken without a map, and the victory declared before evidence appeared. Each memory strengthens resolve, reminding the heart that God has already been trusted and proven faithful before. Faith is reinforced not by new miracles, but by remembered truth. As challenges continue, the believer begins to live differently. Words spoken carry more grace, choices are made with patience, and delays are met with calm instead of frustration. Faith reshapes character quietly but powerfully. This transformation is not dramatic on the surface, but it is profound within, revealing that the greatest evidence of faith is a changed heart. Even when mistakes happen, faith does not collapse. The believer learns that walking by faith does not mean walking perfectly. Grace steps in, restoring confidence and renewing trust. Instead of condemnation, there is humility. Instead of retreat, there is growth. This chapter emphasizes that faith matures not through flawless performance, but through continual dependence on God. As the day moves toward its end, reflection replaces urgency. The believer looks back and recognizes moments where faith held firm, and moments where it wavered. Yet instead of discouragement, gratitude fills the heart. God was present through it all, steady and faithful, guiding even when unnoticed. The prayer has shaped the day more deeply than expected. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new uncertainties, and new opportunities to choose faith again. But the believer is no longer afraid of what cannot be seen. Faith has proven itself sufficient, reliable, and alive beyond the morning. Faith is not confined to prayer. It is revealed in living. The morning prayer has ended, but its power continues. And with each new day, the believer walks forward, not by sight, but by faith that now defines every step of life. As the day draws to a close, faith faces one final and often overlooked test, the quiet of the evening. When activity slows and distractions fade, the heart is left alone with its thoughts. This chapter opens in that still moment, when the believer reflects on the day just lived. Victories may have been small, struggles still unresolved, and prayers not yet answered. The question returns softly but persistently. Was faith enough today? Night has a way of revealing what daylight hides. Fatigue lowers defenses, and doubts attempt to speak with renewed confidence. Sight reviews the day honestly, pointing out unfinished tasks, conversations that went wrong, opportunities missed, and outcomes still unclear. The drama of this chapter lies in the tension between disappointment and trust, as the heart is tempted to measure faith by visible results rather than quiet obedience. Memories of the journey resurface, the uncertain morning, the surrender, the silence, the steps taken without a map. The believer realizes that faith was not only needed at the beginning of the day, but is required again now. Faith is not a one-time decision. It is a continual choice, even when the day ends without clear resolution. This realization deepens the emotional weight of the moment. The believer stands at another crossroads, not outwardly, but inwardly. One path leads to regret, replaying failures and questioning God's timing. The other leads to rest, choosing to trust God with what remains unfinished. This choice is dramatic in its simplicity. To release the day into God's hands without demanding explanations or guarantees for tomorrow. As faith is chosen once more, peace slowly settles in. Not because everything makes sense, but because control is released again. The heart understands that God works beyond daylight hours, beyond human awareness. What feels incomplete to sight is not incomplete to God. This truth transforms rest into an act of faith, not avoidance. Prayer rises again, quieter than in the morning, but deeper. It is no longer a prayer asking for direction, but one offering surrender. The believer entrusts worries, unanswered questions, and future concerns to God, believing that faith does not sleep, even when the body must. This moment carries profound spiritual weight, the decision to trust God with what cannot be fixed tonight. As night deepens, gratitude replaces anxiety. The believer thanks God not only for successes, but for strength given in weakness and faith sustained through uncertainty. The day is no longer judged by outcomes, but by obedience. This shift marks spiritual maturity, learning to rest in God's faithfulness rather than personal performance. Tomorrow remains unseen, but it no longer feels threatening. Faith has been chosen again. At morning, at midday, and now at night. The believer lies down not defeated, but anchored, knowing that walking by faith does not end when the day does. Faith is not only how the day is lived, but how it is released. And in choosing faith again at night, the heart prepares to rise once more, not by sight, but by trust that never rests. Morning comes again, not as a repeat of yesterday, but as a quiet confirmation that faith has endured the night. The believer awakens with the same world waiting outside, yet the heart is no longer the same. This chapter opens with a subtle but powerful shift. Trust has taken root so deeply that fear no longer rushes in at first light. Instead of anxiety setting the tone, there is a steady awareness that God has already gone ahead into this new day. The mind begins to review what lies ahead, responsibilities, uncertainties, conversations yet to happen, but the weight they once carried is noticeably lighter. Faith now responds instinctively, reminding the heart that yesterday's worries did not define the outcome, and neither will today's. This realization is dramatic in its calmness. Peace stands where panic once lived, not because challenges are gone, but because trust has grown stronger. Memories of the journey no longer feel distant. The unanswered questions, the silence, the weary steps, and the bold declarations of faith have all shaped this moment. The believer understands that faith was not tested in vain. It was strengthened for continuity. Walking by faith is no longer a daily restart. It is a flow that carries forward, uninterrupted by the unknown. As the day begins, obedience feels less forced and more natural. Decisions are approached with prayerful confidence rather than hesitation. Even when clarity is absent, the heart no longer stalls. Faith has learned that God's guidance often unfolds alongside movement, not before it. This chapter captures the drama of quiet assurance, a strength that does not announce itself, yet governs every step. Challenges still emerge, but they no longer feel personal or overwhelming. The believer recognizes them as part of the journey, not threats to faith. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening?" the heart now asks, "How can I trust God here?" This shift transforms obstacles into opportunities for deeper reliance, reinforcing faith through practice. Joy begins to surface in unexpected ways. Not a fleeting emotion, but a settled confidence that God is faithful regardless of outcomes. The believer finds joy not because everything works out immediately, but because trust no longer depends on immediate results. This joy becomes a quiet testimony, evidence that faith is alive and active beyond words. As the chapter unfolds, the believer realizes that faith has matured into rest. Not inactivity, but assurance. The pressure to control, to foresee, to secure outcomes has loosened its grip. Trust now holds what fear once carried. This rest is dramatic in its simplicity. It frees the heart to live fully present in the moment. Steady and unafraid. Tomorrow will bring new tests, but faith has proven it can endure. The believer rises into the day with unshaken trust, knowing that sight may change, circumstances may shift, but God remains faithful. Faith that survives the night awakens stronger in the morning. And with each new day, the believer continues the journey. Not striving, not fearing, but walking confidently by faith that has learned to stand firm, even when sight offers no guarantees. As the journey continues, faith begins to find its voice. No longer confined to silent belief or private prayer, it now speaks into situations that once inspired fear. This chapter opens with a powerful shift. The believer no longer reacts to circumstances as they appear, but responds to them through truth. What once silenced the heart now becomes an opportunity for declaration, and faith steps forward with boldness. Challenges arise again. Unexpected news, resistance, delays that test patience, but they no longer dominate the narrative. Instead of allowing circumstances to define reality, the believer learns to speak life where discouragement once ruled. Words of faith replace words of doubt, not as empty optimism, but as alignment with God's promises. This is dramatic because it requires courage to speak hope when evidence seems lacking. The inner dialogue changes noticeably. Where fear once whispered worst-case scenarios, faith now answers with conviction. The believer does not deny difficulty, but refuses to magnify it above God's power. This internal transformation gives rise to outward confidence, proving that faith is not passive. It is assertive, intentional, and alive. As faith speaks, the atmosphere begins to shift. Not always immediately, not always visibly, but consistently. The believer notices that peace follows faith-filled words, and clarity often arrives after courage is expressed. This reinforces a powerful truth. Faith is strengthened when it is spoken, not just felt. Silence once fueled fear. Declaration now fuels endurance. Opposition still comes, sometimes from others, sometimes from within. Voices question the wisdom of trusting what cannot be seen. This chapter grows more dramatic as the believer must choose whether to shrink back or stand firm. Faith chooses to stand, not loudly, not aggressively, but unwaveringly. Confidence is no longer rooted in approval, but in obedience. Through this process, the believer understands that faith is not about convincing others, but about remaining anchored personally. Speaking faith is not performance. It is alignment. Each declaration becomes a reminder to the heart that God's truth remains unchanged, even when circumstances fluctuate. This realization strengthens resolve and deepens spiritual maturity. The act of speaking faith begins to shape identity. The believer no longer sees themselves as someone merely hoping for change, but as someone standing in trust regardless of outcome. This identity shift is profound and dramatic, signaling that faith has moved from reaction to leadership within the soul. Confident posture. Circumstances may still speak, but they no longer speak the loudest. Faith has found its voice, and it carries authority rooted not in sight, but in trust. The believer moves forward strengthened, knowing that when faith speaks, fear must listen, and when faith leads, the journey continues with purpose and power. Time stretches in ways that test even the strongest faith. This chapter opens in the space where prayers have been lifted repeatedly, yet answers remain unseen. The believer stands in a waiting season that feels longer than expected, heavier than anticipated. The drama here is not loud. It is slow, persistent, and deeply personal, pressing faith to prove whether it trusts God's timing as much as God's power. Each passing moment invites frustration. Sight reviews the delay and attempts to interpret it as denial or neglect. The mind replays prayers, searching for reasons why nothing seems to be changing. In this tension, faith is challenged to remain steady, not because waiting is easy, but because it is necessary. The believer begins to understand that delay does not weaken faith. It reveals its depth. Emotionally, the weight of waiting can feel isolating. Others may not see the struggle, and encouragement may feel distant. Yet in this solitude, faith learns to stand without applause or affirmation. This chapter grows more dramatic as the believer resists the urge to rush outcomes or compromise trust simply to escape discomfort. As the waiting continues, a deeper clarity emerges. The believer realizes that God's delays often carry purpose, preparing the heart, aligning circumstances, strengthening character. What appears to be inactivity is often divine orchestration beyond human sight. This realization shifts the tone of the waiting from resentment to reverence. Faith is no longer measured by speed, but by steadiness. The believer learns to show up each day with the same trust, even when yesterday looked exactly like today. This consistency becomes a quiet testimony, proving that faith is not dependent on progress reports, but on confidence in God's faithfulness. Moments of doubt still surface, but they no longer dominate. Faith acknowledges them, then releases them. Instead of demanding immediate results, the heart chooses to remain anchored. This choice is dramatic in its restraint, choosing patience in a culture that demands instant outcomes. As endurance grows, peace settles deeper. The believer understands that standing firm is not passive. It is active trust. Waiting becomes a form of obedience, and perseverance becomes worship. This chapter highlights the strength required to remain faithful when nothing appears to move. The answer may still be delayed, but faith stands tall. The believer is no longer defined by how long the wait lasts, but by how faithfully it is endured. Sight may question the delay, but faith remains confident, knowing that when God moves, He moves with purpose, precision, and perfect timing.